Welcome to episode 18 of Soul Care with Stevie Boy. I feel like I always ought to say, if this is your first time, it's an honor that you would tune in. And if you've been clicking me up and looking at these videos before, I am double honored that you would come back. And if you find value in this, you would do me a wonderful favor if you would pass along to friends, other people you think that might find some value and get some benefit from this. Pass on to them, invite them to join us. Philippians chapter 2, and we are going at not quite a phrase by phrase pace, but almost. And so I'm not going to apologize for it because I'm not really sorry. But here we go. We started moving through in chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort in his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, pause right there. With each if, it's in my mind, I'm almost hearing Paul say, and there is, or else, and there must be. So, if there's any encouragement, if there's any comfort, if there's any fellowship, common sharing, koinonia in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion. You could put both of those words in the bucket of one other word, in my opinion, in the bucket of empathy. Sympathy is me feeling sorry for you. Empathy is me somehow entering into your sorrow with you without judging you and without catastrophizing. But empathy happens best when I feel accepted by you and when your presence requires no kind of effort or measuring up. I mean, that's a pretty poor way of saying it, I suppose, but sometimes getting sympathy feels good, but it's a short-term kind of good feeling. Empathy has a much longer shelf life. Empathy is a power for most people that will help them move forward in the most difficult of times. When Paul writes, if there is any tenderness, I think of family situations here a lot. We've been cooped up with your whole family for the last month, and we're now in what may be the home stretch of this stay-at-home thing. It's pretty hard to remain tender toward your family member. I mean, by now they're getting on your last nerve. By now you've had it up to here with all the bickering, with all the whining, with all the... Boy, it is hard to be tender in those kind of situations, which is an explanation, but not an excuse. See, tenderness, where does tenderness come from? Tenderness comes from love. When I love people, I will be tender toward them. Now, there are times when real love has to be tough. Yes, absolutely. But also, real love will be tender. We tend to be less tender toward the people we are closest to physically in proximity for the longest periods of time. I don't know if you've had this experience, but many of us have, that something would go wrong at work or in another setting, and we come home and somehow all of that negative emotion sloshes out onto our family who had nothing to do with the event that we experienced. Learning how to say no to this tendency to just let it go when I'm at home because I ought to be able to let it go. I don't think you can be tender. I don't think that you can't demonstrate tenderness and give yourself a get out of school card for this negative behavior. If there's any tenderness, I think America is a country of extremes. We have those who are so tender. Every time the ASPCA commercial comes on TV, they start writing $1 million check and wiping away tears. Sorry if you're an animal lover, I don't mean to offend you, but there are times when we go over the top. It bothers me that we can be so emotionally gripped by animals being left unattended and abused. I'm not in favor of any of that. But while that gets, a 2-minute TV commercial, the fact that thousands upon thousands of unborn children are being murdered every day in our country, we don't have time for that. Wow. Didn't even know that was going to come up. So we have the extreme on that. So we have the other extreme that is, whatever. Get over it. Grow up and move on. Where the thing is, I don't care about you. Life's hard and then you die. Excuse me. Somewhere in the middle, there is this tenderness that Paul writes about. That, yes, there should be tenderness. I think in our culture, we have to train ourselves to respond with appropriate tenderness to the situations that we encounter. And Paul leaves us with pretty clear certainty that tenderness ought to be part of the nature of a follower of Jesus. And he links compassion with tenderness. I don't think compassion gets expressed. True compassion is expressed very well without tenderness. So tenderness and compassion, I suppose I would say, point of application, give yourself a grade. Do this observationally, not so much judgmentally, because we don't want to punish ourselves for this, but we do want to be realistic and observe in our own lives, how do we demonstrate tenderness and compassion? Do you do that well? There are times when you are mistaking your tenderness and compassion. It's not quite tenderness and compassion. It's really just permissiveness that says, I wouldn't ever want to make you unhappy, so anything you want to do, we'll let you do. That's not tenderness and compassion. Tenderness and compassion come into play when life gets really hard and the consequences of our choices begin to bite us, or when the consequences of someone else's choice begin to bite us. That's when tenderness and compassion come into play. Then he says in verse 2, hooray, we're on to verse 2. Then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Paul offers an interesting thing. Make my joy complete. I don't think we often enough think about Paul and what his deepest motivations were, because he's so driven. And I think certainly his deepest of all motivations is to bring honor to Christ in all he does, with all of his life, with his one and only life. And I want that to be my motivation in my core, and yours as well. But he uses a word here that pops up in several forms over and over again through this entire book. Make my joy complete. I've said it when we first encountered this idea of joy or rejoicing, that joy has very little to do with circumstance. Happiness is pretty much all about circumstance. Happening comes from the same root as happiness. And in terms of a biblical faith, Paul's faith, this had little to do with circumstance. His joy being made complete. Well, what would complete his joy? What would fulfill his longing? What would fill his tank? Make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit, and of one mind. Well, he's just identified all the pieces of you and I. Like-minded, that is our intellectual being, having the same love. These are our affections, that's our heart. Being one in spirit and of one mind. What I think he's saying is we are not just intellectually stimulated by the same things, but we have set our minds, we have set our hearts, we have set our affections. We are responding in our spirit to the guidance and leading of God's Spirit together. What he's talking about here, simply put, is unity. Some people find unity a difficult thing to achieve. I think this is true in America because we are so independent. Our country would not have grown if our collective being was not independent. Every time Debbie and I used to drive from Oklahoma to Las Vegas, where we lived, back and forth. Every time coming from Oklahoma, going west, you drive through the Texas Panhandle and then New Mexico and then into eastern Arizona, and then you see the mountains at Flagstaff. And every time I thought I would never have been a pioneer, because there's nothing in me that says, oh, wow, mountains, let's cross a mountain. I'd be looking for a flat spot with a little bit of water and maybe a tree, and I'd say, I think I'm done. Well, independence can be very, very powerful, but there's this idea about independence that I think is worth I don't want to camp out, but at least make a point with. Stephen Covey talks about stages of dependence and independence. We're born into the world and we are totally dependent. And as we develop, a part of what is supposed to happen is that we become more and more and more independent. We need less from other people in order to survive and even thrive. In our culture, independence has become the objective. Well, there is this higher level beyond independence, and it's called interdependence. This is where two independent people release their independence so that they can achieve a common goal together. That, I think, is a description of Christ's family, God's family. We are growing to become interdependent. And I could go on and on about that, but here's the point I want to make. Sometimes we desire independence so strongly that it becomes almost impossible for us to come to unity. One of the questions that I think the American church, the truth is, the universal church has had to grapple with is, what is essential and what is not essential? There are practices, there are preferences, there are even theological points that if we make these things that are important or valuable but not essential, if we put them into the essential category, we create division, not unity. Paul says if the things that would make my joy complete is a unity, like-mindedness, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. So we'll leave it there because my time's up, but I want to challenge you with this. I want you to, because of this whole unity idea, I want you to think about what are the things, where would you draw the line and say, okay, I'll compromise on other things, but these things I will not, I can't, my conscience won't let me compromise on. It's not the kind of thing you normally think about, but it's worth thinking about here because if we're to be like-minded, if we're to have the same love and the one in spirit and one in mind, we're going to have to somehow come to these are the things that are non-negotiable. If we can agree on these things, we can create, or not create, but we can sustain unity. If we can't, excuse me, I don't remember eating that. Anyway, if we can't establish unity over these things that are non-negotiable for us, I don't know, we could try to do a unification thing, but that's not unity. Make a list. And then after you've made the list, then go down through it and go, really? Truly? Truly? It's a good exercise of mind and heart. And next time we'll pick it up where Paul starts talking about specifics of, so what does this look like? I look forward to connecting with you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.